Okay, welcome to episode 9 of our series, the Torah review of vegetarianism. Last week I mentioned that this was going to be the final episode. That was actually erroneous because we're going to have another episode next week, so that's something good to look forward to. But in the meantime, I'm going to pass you over to Michael Colati, who's been an absolute star over the past few weeks, and he's going to quote from you for a text. But before that, he wants to mention something very special.
Thank you, Rav Mashiach. We're actually recording this on the yard site of my father, Levi ben Moshe Kalati, his yard site, the 33rd year. I wanted to dedicate this to his memory, and my sister Elisheva Yael Bat Levi. Basically, my father taught me many, many things, but he taught me also tza'ar Chayim in a very, very funny way. When I was very young, I used to take showers in our family home, and very occasionally I used to share a shower with a big fat spider. And I have a terrible phobia of spiders. And I remember it was because we lived in the suburbs, they were kind of very plentiful and very meaty, these big spiders. And I remember getting into the shower, half expecting to find one, then finding it, and then jumping out, putting a towel on and screaming to my dad, please come help me, kill the spider, get rid of the spider. And I was panicking. I was a very young boy at the time. And he would slowly walk in, smiling at me, and he wouldn't go like I was begging him, just kill it. He would walk in slowly, take a tissue paper, and gently, very gently lift the spider, and I could see its legs struggling, but I could tell my father was touching it as gently as possible. He would walk towards the window in a very calm way, and he would open the window and let the spider loose to go in the garden somewhere. And the spider had no idea how lucky he was to be caught on my dad. And even though I was panicking and I was like, in a state of shock, I looked at him and realized that this was what life is about: compassion to animals, understanding your place in the world. It's very easy to kill the spider because it's scaring your child, but he realized that the spider was not to blame. The spider found itself in our house, and it wasn't the spider's fault, and the spider had deserved the right to continue its life. And he taught me something. Even though I was nervous at the time, he taught me, I watched him and I learned from that, and that was a very important lesson. And I want to dedicate all of these lessons that we've been talking about the last few weeks to my father, who was a great teacher and example to me.
And me.
And thank you very much. Today I wanted to talk about something that was written by Rabbi David Sears, who wrote a book called The Vision of Eden. I wanted to give an abridged summary of this work. This is from A Vision of Eden, Animal Welfare and Vegetarianism in Jewish Law and Mysticism. If you'll bear with me, I would like to read a few pages of this beautiful book. Okay, to quote from Tehillim, God is good to all, and his mercy is upon all his works. This is from Tehillim 145, verse 9. This verse is the touchstone of the rabbinic attitude toward animal welfare, appearing in a number of contexts in Torah literature. At first glance, its relevance may be somewhat obscure. It speaks of God, not man. However, a basic rule of Jewish ethics is the emulation of God's ways. In the words of the Talmudic sages, just as he clothes the naked, so shall you clothe the naked. Just as he is merciful, so shall you be merciful. Therefore, compassion for all creatures, including animals, is not only God's business, it is a virtue that we, too, must emulate. Moreover, rabbinic tradition asserts that God's mercy supersedes all other divine attributes. Thus, compassion must not be reckoned as one good trait amongst others. Rather, it is central to our entire approach to life. This leads us to the concept of the unity of all things. A fundamental premise of Judaism is belief in the absolute and encompassing oneness of the Creator, who brings all things into being. In addition to defining our view of the Creator, this premise informs our view of creation. Since creation in all its diversity flows from the divine oneness, it follows that in its essence all creation is one, a mystical concept that has profound spiritual and ethical implications. If all creation constitutes a unitary whole, then all things from the highest to lowest entity in the hierarchy of creation share a spiritual affinity with one another. Not that the universe is divine. The identification of nature and God is pantheism, a belief inconsistent with the doctrine of God's incorporeality. Pantheism also disputes the concept of free choice, bechira chofshis, through its implicit moral determinism. Rather, the spiritual affinity of which we speak exists by virtue of the Infinite One who produces and encompasses all things, while at the same time transcending them. As the verse attests in Psalms 104, verse 24, "How worthy are your works, O God! You have created them all with wisdom." For this paramount reason, it is natural and proper for human beings to feel kinship with animals, despite the physical and spiritual differences between them. Rav Moshe Cordovero states, "Although God transcends creation, he sustains all living beings, from the highest to the lowest, and does not disparage any creature. For if he were to reject any creature due to its inferiority, none could exist even for a moment. Instead, he watches over and shows mercy to all. Similarly, a person should be benevolent to everyone, and no creature should seem despicable to him. Even the smallest living thing should be exceedingly worthy in his eyes." Next, I'd like to talk about kindness towards animals. Benevolence entails action. Thus, Judaism goes beyond the subjective factor of moral sentiment and mandates kindness towards animals in halacha. It prohibits their abuse, praises their good traits, and obligates their owners concerning their well-being. As we shall see, even man's self-serving use of animals can bring about their spiritual benefits. Certainly, this should be part of our conscious intent in using animals, as well as in using any of the world's resources. By example of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs, the Torah describes the way of right action. Avraham personifies the divine trait of chesed, which is kindness. Thus, the Midrash cites a dialogue in which Avraham tells Noach and his sons that they survived the flood because of the faithfulness with which they cared for the animals on the ark. In Bereshis, Avraham's servant Eliezer determines that Rivka is a worthy bride for Yitzchak when, after serving him water, she voluntarily gives water to his camels. This act of kindness, both to strangers and animals, proves her worthiness to enter the family of Avraham, and thus to become one of the mothers of the Jewish people. Yaakov too is distinguished by an act of kindness towards animals. Rabbi Chayim ibn Attar proposes that Yaakov may have been the first person to build animal shelters out of compassion for his flocks. This was in, I believe, Sukkot. Not only are animals deserving of our compassion, but we may learn a number of good traits from them. The Talmud attests that the Torah not being given, we might have learned modesty from the cat, honest labor from the ant, marital fidelity from the dove, and consideration of one's mate from the rooster. To be sure, Judaism asserts that the world, with all its contents, is not an end unto itself, but serves as a backdrop for man, in particular for man's exercise of free will. In the phrase of the Hasidic master, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, I quote, "Everything you see in the world, everything that exists, is for the sake of free will. This is the central challenge of our lives. For by choosing the path of belief in God and Torah observance, or in the case of non-Jews, by heeding the 7 universal laws of Noach, a person can achieve intimacy with the Creator. This is not true of a master-slave relationship, which is devoid of the element of choice. Nevertheless, if man is the main performer on the stage of creation, this does not mean that the supporting cast is of small consequence. Indeed, the divine call to venture beyond the ego and develop a sense of compassion for the rest of creation is a key part of the cosmic test. One should respect all creatures, asserts Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, recognizing in them the greatness of the Creator who formed man with wisdom. All creatures are imbued with the Creator's wisdom, which itself makes them greatly deserving of honor. The Maker of all, the wise one who transcends everything, is associated with his creatures in having made them. If one were to disparage them, God forbid, this would reflect upon the honor of their Maker. Because man is the central figure in creation, he is responsible for the rest of the world. The Torah describes how God placed Adam and Eve in the center of Eden and commanded them to tend and watch over the garden. Symbolically, this defines humanity's continuing role as a custodian of nature. As a point of theology, it also has important ethical halachic consequences. We must seek to relieve the suffering of animals. We must properly feed and attend the domestic animals under our care. Our animals must rest on the Sabbath. We only may take the life of an animal to serve a legitimate human need. Acts of wanton destructiveness are forbidden. And according to the Sefer HaChinuch, the prohibition of slaughtering an animal and its young on the same day teaches us that it is forbidden to bring about the destruction of any species. Through our emulation of God, we become the instrument of God's compassion for the world that He created and pronounced good. The hallmark of wisdom. Compassion for animals is the measure of spiritual refinement. In his classic work of Jewish ethics, Mesilas Yesharim, Rabbi Moshe Chayim Luzzatto asserts that it is one of the basic characteristics of a chassid, by which he means a person striving for spiritual perfection. Indeed, the Midrash states that both Moshe Rabbeinu and David HaMelech were chosen by God to be leaders of Israel because of their compassion they have previously demonstrated towards their flocks. There are countless tales of tzaddikim and their concern for the well-being of animals. As several stories in this volume demonstrate, this concern may extend even to wild creatures for which we bear no direct responsibility. Despite the apparent multiformity of the universe, there is an underlying spiritual connection between all things. Kabbalistic works speak of 4 elements: earth, afar, water, mayim, air, ruach, and fire, eish. In modern scientific terms, these are the 4 states of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and energy. The 4 elements, in turn, parallel the 4 levels of existence: silent things, which are domem, vegetation, tzomeach, animals, chai, and human beings, medaber, as well as the 4 worlds or levels of reality. The world of action, asiyah, includes the entire physical universe. The 3 higher worlds are those of formation, yetzirah, creation, beriah, and emanation, atzilus. Beyond these categories are transcendent levels of which we cannot even begin to speak. The universe is wondrously diverse. All things differ in form, intellect, and purpose. Nevertheless, there exists a commonality among all creatures in that everything reflects God's wisdom and is part of the divine plan. This is not merely an abstract concept, but a potent subject for contemplation for anyone who seeks a more enlightened way of relating to the world. The Baal Shem Tov, founder of the Hasidic movement, declares, "Do not consider yourself superior to anyone else. In truth, you are no different than any other creature, since all things were brought into being to serve God. Just as God bestows consciousness upon you, so does he bestow consciousness upon your fellow man. In what way is a human being superior to a worm? A worm serves a creator with all of his intelligence and ability, and man, too, is compared to a worm or a maggot, as the verse states in Psalms 22, verse 7, I am a worm and not a man. If God had not given you a human intellect, you would only be able to serve him like a worm. In this sense, you are both equal in the eyes of heaven. A person should consider himself and the worm and all creatures as comrades in the universe, for we are all created beings whose abilities are God-given. Compassion and enlightenment. The Baal Shem Tov's words proceed from a deeply mystical perception. All things are animated by God, and thus constitute a garment for him. As he observes, all the worlds are garments, each one for the next, down to the lowest aspect. This concept is suggested by the verse that states in Psalms 104, Posuk 2, he covers himself with light as a garment. In Kabbalistic terms, this alludes to the infinite light of creation, the Ar Ein Sof. The infinite light, in turn, is garbed through numerous acts of constriction, tzimtzumim, that produce the various worlds, culminating in the physical universe. Thus, the universe may be conceived as the outermost garment of God, beneath which his infinite light is concealed. Although some elements may be primary and others secondary, all parts of the garment exist in symbiotic relationship with one another, and they possess meaning by virtue of the one who fashioned the garment for his own purpose. Therefore, the Baal Shem Tov teaches us, the enlightened person will sense the comradeship of man and the worm and all small creatures, and relate to all of God's work with love. As the Maharal of Prague observes, love of all creatures is also love of God, for whoever loves the one loves all the works which he has made. The realization of this truth is the central point of Jewish mysticism, and it is the root of the Jewish ethic of compassion for all creatures.
Wow, that is absolutely fantastic.
And it's a very, very beautiful, and it describes many of the ideas of respecting for creatures, and also how it relates to Kabbalah and mysticism.
Okay, wonderful, fantastic. Okay, so that's great. So next week was our final episode, and we have something very, very special for you. I think we're gonna keep it secret. Or we're gonna tell them what it is next week.
Tell them next week.
We'll tell them next week. Okay, so you have to stay tuned. We've got something extremely rare and extremely special. So, with that, thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you very much, Abhishek.
And we'll see you next week, Bezrat Hashem.